The fluorescent lights in the police station flickered slightly, casting an eerie glow over the room. The air smelled of coffee that had been sitting too long and the faint trace of cheap cologne. She sat there, her hands resting on the cold metal table, breathing slowly, evenly, forcing herself to stay calm. Across from her, the cop leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug grin stretching across his face. He was enjoying this. "You people," he said, shaking his head as if she were some kind of disappointment, as if her very existence offended him. "Always thinking you're above the law. Always acting like you don't have to follow the rules." He chuckled to himself, tapping a pen against his thigh. "Let me tell you something, sweetheart. This time, you're not walking away." She held his gaze, silent, unflinching. He wanted her to break, wanted her to beg or cry or lash out. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "You got nothing to say now, huh? Not so tough anymore." He leaned in, lowering his voice, his tone turning venomous. "You should be grateful we even let you sit in here instead of locking you up in the back with the others. But I gotta say, watching you squirm, it's almost better than seeing you behind bars." The words were sharp, meant to cut deep. But she had heard them before. Maybe not in these exact words, maybe not from this exact man, but the meaning was always the same. A heavy door creaked open, and a second officer stepped inside, handing him a folder. He flipped it open, scanning the pages, his grin widening. "Well, well, well. Looks like we got a repeat offender," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "This isn't your first time causing trouble, is it? Let me guess, stealing? Drugs? Fraud? Maybe all of the above?" She didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. "You know, it's funny," he continued, tossing the file onto the table. "Every time someone like you ends up in here, they all say the same thing. It's a mistake. It's a misunderstanding. I didn't do anything wrong. But we both know the truth, don't we?" He smirked, standing up, towering over her. "You people don't belong in places like this. You don't belong anywhere but behind bars." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, she leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you think I did?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, I don't need to think, sweetheart. I know. We got witnesses. We got evidence. And most importantly, we got you." His arrogance was suffocating. He thought he had one. A knock on the door interrupted the moment. The second officer poked his head in again, looking uneasy. "Sir, the judge is ready." The cop grinned, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her to her feet. Showtime. The walk to the courtroom was slow and deliberate. Every step felt heavier than the last. He wanted everyone to see her, wanted them to whisper and stare. By the time they entered the courtroom, she could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her. The judge barely looked up as the officer spoke. "Your Honor, we got this one red-handed. No doubt about it." The judge flipped through the file, frowning slightly. And then, something changed. A flicker of confusion. A slow exhale. He looked up, really looking at her for the first time. And then, with a voice filled with something close to disbelief, he asked, "Officer, are you sure about this?" The cop frowned. "Of course, I'm sure. What kind of question is that?" The judge set the file down, folding his hands in front of him. "Because if you had taken even a second to do your job properly, you would have realized that the woman standing in front of you is no ordinary suspect." Silence. The officer turned to look at her, but for the first time, the smirk was gone. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, reaching inside her jacket. And then, with the calmest voice in the room, she said the words that would change everything. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent." The color drained from his face. The room fell into stunned silence. Because the woman he had dragged in here, the woman he had mocked, humiliated, and paraded like a trophy, was a federal agent. And she wasn't just any agent. She was one of the highest ranking in her division. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had made a mistake. A career-ending, life-destroying mistake. But what he didn't know yet, what no one knew yet, was that this mistake. It was only the beginning. Hey there, family. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand against any form of racism, prejudice, or injustice. This story is not just a twist-filled drama, it's a powerful statement about dignity, resilience, and justice. To all our black viewers, know that you are seen, you are valued, and you deserve respect. If you believe in equality and powerful storytelling, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, sit back and enjoy an unforgettable story. Let's get into it. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed faintly, their dull glow reflecting off the scuffed linoleum floor. The air was thick with the stale scent of burnt coffee, sweat, and cheap aftershave, a mixture that clung to the walls like an unshakable residue of exhaustion and indifference. The space hummed with the low murmur of officers exchanging half-hearted banter, the occasional burst of laughter cutting through the otherwise monotonous atmosphere. It was a place of routine, of endless repetition, another suspect, another charge, another set of papers to file before the shift ended. For Janelle Carter, however, this was anything but routine. She sat rigidly in the cold metal chair, her hands resting on the unforgiving surface of the interrogation table. The cuffs around her wrists were unnecessarily tight, a deliberate act of discomfort, an unspoken message. She could feel the weight of them digging into her skin, the pressure a dull throb she refused to acknowledge. Her heartbeat remained steady, her breathing even, but beneath the surface, something was simmering. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was something deeper, something that had been planted long ago and had only grown stronger over the years. A quiet, relentless fury. Across from her, Officer Greg Larsson sat with an infuriating ease, his body language dripping with unchecked arrogance. His chair was tilted back just slightly, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his entire demeanor radiating the confidence of a man who had spent years getting away with things he shouldn't have. He wasn't just comfortable, he was enjoying this. There was something in his eyes, a cruel amusement, as he studied her, as if he were waiting for the moment when she would finally crack, when she would plead, when she would beg. "You people," he muttered, shaking his head, his smirk widening as if he found the whole situation amusing. "Always thinking you're too good for the rules. Always walking around like the world owes you something." He let out a low chuckle, tapping a pen against the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Let me tell you something, sweetheart. Today, you're not walking away. Today, you finally get to learn that actions have consequences." Janelle didn't react. She held his gaze with an expression so unreadable it was almost infuriating. Greg let out a slow whistle, shaking his head again, as if disappointed. "Oh, you got nothing to say now? All that attitude, all that confidence, where'd it go? Not so tough anymore, huh?" She still didn't respond. Silence, she had learned long ago, was its own kind of weapon. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, closing the space between them. "Come on, sweetheart. I know your type. I've been dealing with you people for years. Always got an excuse, always got a story. But see, I don't need to hear it. I already know exactly who you are. You're just another one of them. Another criminal who thought she could get away with it." She exhaled slowly through her nose, her expression unchanged. Greg smirked, leaning back again. "You know, I gotta say, you surprised me. Usually, when we bring people like you in, they're all talk. All tough until they realize they're actually in trouble. But you got a real air about you. Like you actually think you're better than all this." She said nothing. Greg laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, I see. You're one of those. Think if you just stay quiet long enough, you'll get out of this. Like you're some kind of exception. He let the words hang for a moment before continuing, his tone growing colder. You're not. You never were. A heavy knock on the door interrupted the moment. Another officer stepped inside, handing Greg a thick manila folder. He flipped it open, scanning the contents, and a slow grin spread across his face. Well, he mused, shaking his head as he glanced at her again. Looks like we got a real troublemaker here. He turned a page, his grin widening. Repeat offender, huh? Let me guess, shoplifting. Fraud. Oh, or maybe you got a little drug problem. He let out another chuckle, tapping the folder. See, this is the thing. Every single person that comes through here thinks they're special. Thinks they've got some big, important reason why they shouldn't be here. But guess what? That's not how the world works. Not for you. The words were sharp, meant to cut deep, meant to remind her exactly where she was and who was in control. She kept her expression neutral, but inside, the storm was building. Greg shook his head, closing the folder with a decisive snap. Well, sweetheart, I gotta say, this is one hell of a way to end up in front of a judge. But don't worry. I'll make sure they go easy on you. Maybe if you flash a nice little smile, they'll shave a couple months off your sentence. He stood, grabbing her arm with unnecessary force, yanking her up from the chair. She allowed it, her body stiff but compliant. The walk through the station was slow and deliberate. Officers barely glanced up as they passed, their conversations continuing as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Because to them, this wasn't out of the ordinary. This was routine. A black woman being led through the halls in handcuffs. That wasn't worth a second glance. The courtroom was just as she expected. The judge barely looked up as Greg dragged her in, shoving her toward the defendant's table. He was still wearing that smirk, still basking in the control he thought he had. Your Honor, Greg said, his voice dripping with confidence. This one's a no-brainer. Caught red-handed. No doubt about it. The judge flipped through the file, his frown deepening as he read. And then, something shifted. A flicker of hesitation. A slow exhale. The judge looked up, his gaze settling on her with something that almost resembled disbelief. Officer Larsson, he said, his voice measured, careful. Are you absolutely sure about this? Greg's smirk faltered just slightly. Of course, I'm sure. What kind of question is that? The judge set the file down, folding his hands in front of him. Because if you had taken even a second to do your job properly, you would have realized that the woman standing in front of you is not just some suspect. The room went still. Greg turned toward her, confusion knitting his brow. Janelle met his gaze, and for the first time, she moved. Her hand slipped into her jacket, slowly, deliberately. And then, with a calm, measured voice, she spoke the words that would shatter his entire world. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Janelle Carter. The color drained from his face. Because the woman he had humiliated, mocked, paraded through the station like a trophy, was a high-ranking FBI agent. And she wasn't just any agent. She was one of the most decorated in her division. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He had made a mistake. A career-ending, life-destroying mistake. But what he didn't know yet, what no one in that room knew yet, was that this mistake. It was only the beginning. The courtroom air felt heavier now, charged with a tension so thick it seemed to settle into the very foundation of the building. The scent of old wood polish and aged paper mixed with the distant hum of murmured conversations, yet all of it faded into the background. All that mattered in that moment was the storm building between two people standing on opposite sides of justice. Janelle Carter remained seated at the defendant's table, her posture rigid yet controlled. Every breath she took was measured, steady, even as the walls of injustice closed in around her. But she wasn't afraid. No, fear was not something she entertained, not now, not ever. What she felt was something else entirely. A slow, simmering certainty that the man standing just a few feet away had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Officer Greg Larsson still carried himself with the air of a man who had spent a lifetime getting away with everything. His broad shoulders squared with an arrogance so deeply ingrained it seemed to fuel his very existence. His smirk, a permanent fixture, tugged at the corners of his mouth, though there was something different now, a flicker, a barely perceptible crack in the mask of unshakable confidence he always wore. The judge, an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes, sat at the bench flipping through the file before him. With each page he turned, his frown deepened, his fingers tightening ever so slightly against the paper. He exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate, before removing his glasses and setting them down. "Officer Larsson," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "are you absolutely certain about the circumstances of this arrest?" Greg barely concealed his irritation, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't see what there is to question. I was doing my job." She was a disturbance, plain and simple. The murmurs in the courtroom grew, quiet at first, then swelling into something more. The weight of eyes pressing in on him should have been suffocating, but Greg Larsson had never known what it was like to feel accountable for his actions. He had built his career on the belief that men like him were untouchable. That belief was starting to waver, but not enough for him to let it go. The judge inhaled slowly, his fingers lacing together as he leaned forward just slightly. "A disturbance," he repeated, his tone unreadable. Greg nodded. "That's right." The judge glanced at Janelle, then back at Greg. "And what exactly did she do?" Greg scoffed, the sound laced with frustration. "Look, Your Honor, we both know how this goes. People like her." Janelle's eyes darkened. The judge raised an eyebrow. "People like her?" Greg hesitated for half a second before barreling forward. "Yes. People like her. Think they can walk into places they don't belong, act however they want, and then cry victim when we enforce the law." Janelle let out a slow breath through her nose. The fire in her chest did not burn hot, it burned cold, calculated. "I see," the judge said, his tone neutral, but there was something dangerous in the way he studied Greg now. Greg, oblivious, pushed forward. "I don't know what the issue here is. I've seen this routine 1,000 times. She walks in, causes a scene, then expects to just walk away. Not this time." Janelle tilted her head, watching him. The cracks in his armor were small, but they were spreading. "Not this time," she echoed, finally speaking. Her voice was measured, calm, but it carried a weight that cut through the space between them like a blade. Greg turned his attention to her, his lips curling into something between amusement and irritation. "That's right. You think you're special. You think you get to just sit there all high and mighty because you wear fancy clothes and talk like you belong here? Let me tell you something, none of that changes what you are." The silence that followed was deafening. Janelle let the words hang in the air, let them settle, let him feel the weight of what he had just said. Then, she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table, her expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you think I am, Officer Larsson?" Greg hesitated for just a moment too long. He scoffed. "A criminal." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Janelle's fingers curled against the polished wood of the table, but her expression remained calm, almost detached. The judge cleared his throat. "Officer Larsson, I suggest you choose your next words carefully." Greg straightened. "I don't need to choose anything carefully. I did my job. I saw what I saw. And I know exactly the kind of person I'm dealing with here." Janelle exhaled softly, then slowly, deliberately, reached into her jacket. Greg's body tensed, just slightly. A muscle twitched in his jaw. His instinct betrayed his confidence for the first time. And then, she placed her badge on the table. The room stilled. Greg blinked, his smirk vanishing. The courtroom's whispers rose to an electrified hum as people craned their necks, leaning in, desperate to see what had just changed the atmosphere so drastically. The gold of the badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Janelle met Greg's gaze and, in the calmest voice in the room, said, "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Janelle Carter." The silence that followed was suffocating. Greg's body stiffened, his face paling, his breath faltering. This is some kind of joke," he muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Janelle tilted her head, watching him, her eyes locked onto his like a predator watching its prey. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The realization hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. The weight of his mistake crashed down upon him, yet he still clung to his delusion. "This is impossible," he muttered. You can't be FBI." Janelle let the silence stretch again before speaking. "You arrested me without cause. You humiliated me, mocked me, treated me like I was beneath you. And you did all of that without once stopping to consider the possibility that you were making the biggest mistake of your life." Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. Janelle let that moment hang, let him feel what it was like to be on the receiving end of absolute, undeniable power. Then, finally, she leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing over her chest. "You see, Officer Larsson," she said, her voice like ice, "I wasn't just some random woman in a police station. I was there for a reason. And that reason?" She let the tension build, let the reality of his situation begin to sink in. "That reason was you." Greg took a small step back, a subconscious movement of a man who suddenly understood that the walls were closing in. The murmurs in the courtroom grew, swelling like a rising tide. The judge remained silent, his expression unreadable, but there was something gnawing in his eyes. Janelle studied Greg, watching as the weight of his actions began to take shape in his mind. "And now," she said, her voice smooth, unwavering, "we're going to find out just how deep this corruption runs." Greg's breath hitched. For the first time in his life, he was the one trapped. The air in the courtroom had changed. It was no longer just tense, it was suffocating, thick with the weight of a revelation that no one had seen coming. The murmurs had died down to a stunned silence, as if the very walls were holding their breath. All eyes were locked onto one man. Greg Larsson stood frozen, his usually smug expression replaced with something far less controlled. His jaw was tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if steadying himself against a sudden shift in gravity. His eyes darted from Janelle to the judge, then to the badge that sat between them like an open wound. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Janelle remained seated, her posture relaxed, but there was something deadly in the way she watched him now. The power had shifted, and she was in no rush to ease him into that realization. Greg cleared his throat, forcing out a hollow laugh. "This is a joke. Some kind of setup." Janelle arched an eyebrow. "A setup?" He gestured vaguely, his movements sharp, erratic. "You people are always trying to pull something. Trying to twist the system, make yourselves out to be the victims. But this? This is next level." Janelle leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her fingers lacing together. "Tell me, Officer Larsson, what exactly am I pulling?" His mouth opened, but no words came. The judge exhaled heavily, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench to regain control of the room. "Officer Larsson," he said, his tone now carrying an edge of warning, "I suggest you choose your next words carefully." Greg swallowed, visibly grappling with the reality pressing down on him. He had spent years manipulating situations, twisting narratives to his advantage. But there was no twisting this. "You arrested me without cause," Janelle continued, her voice even but unwavering. "Paraded me through that station. Humiliated me in front of your colleagues. Treated me like I was beneath you. And the entire time, you had no idea that you were making the single biggest mistake of your career. Greg shook his head. This is some kind of trick. I don't buy it. Janelle reached into her jacket, pulling out a small stack of neatly folded papers. She placed them on the table and slid them toward the judge. This is my personnel file. Clearance level, FBI credentials, investigative history. It confirms everything I just said. Greg's throat bobbed as he watched the judge unfold the papers and scan them. Every second felt like a lifetime. Finally, the judge looked up, expression unreadable. These credentials check out. Greg's breath came shorter now. His mind raced, searching for an escape. There had to be one. There always was. Janelle tilted her head slightly. Tell me something, Officer Larsson. How many people have you done this to? His lips pressed together. How many people have you dragged into that station just like you dragged me? How many have you humiliated, locked up, ruined, just because you could? His eyes flickered with something defensive, something panicked. That's not what this is. No. Janelle leaned back. Then what is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a pattern. A very dangerous, very illegal pattern. The judge cleared his throat. Special Agent Carter, are you suggesting misconduct beyond this incident? Janelle didn't take her eyes off Greg. I don't think. I know. Greg's hands curled into fists at his sides. You have no proof of that. A small smile ghosted over Janelle's lips. You sure about that? The judge lifted an eyebrow. Agent Carter, do you have evidence of prior misconduct? Janelle took her time before responding. I do. In fact, Officer Larsson here was already on a watch list. Greg's entire body stiffened. Janelle reached into her bag again, pulling out another folder, this one thicker. She placed it on the table with deliberate care, her fingers tapping against the cover. This, she said, voice steady, is a compiled report of civilian complaints, internal investigations, and excessive force accusations tied to Officer Larsson over the past 10 years. Greg's face drained of color. The judge took the folder, flipping through it with growing concern. The deeper he read, the harder his expression became. Janelle watched Greg carefully. Tell me, Officer Larsson, do you remember DeAndre Ellis? The name landed like a blow. Greg flinched before he could stop himself. Janelle nodded slightly. I thought you might. Greg shook his head. That was investigated. Oh, it was, Janelle agreed, her voice deceptively light. And somehow, despite multiple witness testimonies stating that you used excessive force, despite clear evidence of a fabricated charge, the case was quietly dropped. Why do you think that is? Greg's jaw clenched. Or how about Luis Mendoza? Janelle continued, tilting her head. 17 years old. No prior record. Picked up on suspicion of theft and found himself in holding for 2 nights with no explanation. Tell me, Officer Larsson, was that just another mistake? The judge's expression darkened as he continued reading. The weight of what he was seeing, what he was beginning to understand, settled into the room like a lead weight. Janelle exhaled slowly. And now, here we are. Me, in this courtroom. Because you thought you could do it again. Because you thought no one would question it. Greg's breathing was shallow now. His confidence had crumbled, his stance less assured, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to grab something, anything, to ground himself. Janelle leaned forward just slightly, just enough for her voice to reach him without anyone else hearing. But you picked the wrong one this time. Greg's nostrils flared, his mind spinning, but the walls had already closed in. The judge finally set the folder down with a controlled exhale. Officer Larsson, in light of this information, I'm ordering an immediate suspension pending a formal investigation. Furthermore, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Several figures in dark suits entered, their movements efficient, precise. The kind of precision that only came with authority. Greg's stomach dropped. The lead agent stepped forward, nodding toward the judge before turning his attention to Greg. "Officer Larsson," he said, his voice crisp, "official, you're coming with us." Greg stumbled back, his head shaking violently. "No. No, this is," Janelle stood, smoothing her jacket. "You said earlier that I was finally learning my place." Greg looked at her, and for the first time, there was no smugness, no confidence, no belief in his own invincibility. Janelle exhaled, her voice calm, steady. "It's about time you learned yours." The agents moved in. Greg's protests turned into nothing but empty noise. And just like that, the man who had spent years tearing others down was finally brought to his knees. Greg Larsson's entire body was rigid, his breathing shallow as the agents moved in around him. His fingers twitched as if his body wanted to fight, to resist, to deny what was happening, but his brain was catching up too slowly to process the reality. His world, built on arrogance and the unchecked power he had wielded for years, was collapsing right in front of him. One of the agents, a tall man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped closer, reaching into his jacket to pull out a set of handcuffs. "Officer Larsson, you are under federal investigation for multiple counts of civil rights violations, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. You are to be taken into federal custody immediately." Greg let out a sharp laugh, but there was no confidence in it. It was jagged, panicked, like a drowning man gasping for air. "This is insane. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just doing my job." Janelle crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly as she watched him unravel. "Your job." She let the words hang in the air before stepping closer, lowering her voice just enough that it cut through the noise. "Tell me something, Officer Larsson, when did your job become about hunting people down based on nothing but your own biases? When did your job become about humiliating innocent people just because you could? Because that's what you've been doing for years, haven't you? Thinking no one would ever come for you. Thinking you were untouchable." Greg's jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring. "You think you know me? You don't know anything about me." Janelle's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, but I do. And so does the entire department. And internal affairs. And now, the federal government." The murmurs in the courtroom swelled again, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone present. People leaned in, whispering amongst themselves, eyes darting between Greg and the agents surrounding him. Some faces were stunned, others filled with quiet satisfaction, and a few, fellow officers, were unreadable, their expressions caught somewhere between discomfort and realization. Greg's eyes flicked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who would stand up for him. But there was no one. Not a single person stepped forward to vouch for him. Not a single voice came to his defense. The realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. The lead agent took another step forward, reaching for Greg's wrist. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Greg stumbled back, shaking his head furiously. "No, no, you don't understand. This isn't what it looks like." His eyes snapped to Janelle, desperation creeping into his voice. "You set me up. That's what this is. You came after me. This isn't justice. This is revenge." Janelle's expression didn't change. "Revenge?" She let out a quiet breath, something almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You really think this is about revenge? You did this to yourself, Greg. Every single time you used your badge as a weapon instead of a shield. Every single time you decided someone's fate before they even had a chance to speak. Every single time you let your hatred dictate your actions instead of the law you swore to uphold. This isn't revenge. This is justice." Greg's breathing turned erratic, his eyes darting toward the judge, as if the very man who had just ordered his suspension would somehow step in to save him. But the judge simply exhaled, his expression heavy. Officer Larsson, it would be in your best interest to comply. Greg's face twisted with something ugly, resentment, fury, humiliation all rolled into one. You think this makes you better than me? His voice was raw now, desperate, teetering between rage and disbelief. You sit there, acting all high and mighty, but you know what? You're just like me. You think you're different, but you're not. You wanted this to happen. You wanted to see me fall. Janelle took a slow step toward him, lowering her voice, making sure every syllable cut through him like a blade. The difference between you and me, Greg, is that I worked for my power. I earned my place. I never had to step on people to stand tall. I never needed to make others feel small to feel important. And you? You never had any real power. You only had fear. And now that it's gone, you're nothing. Greg's breath hitched, his eyes wide with something close to disbelief. It was as if, for the first time in his life, someone had looked at him and truly seen him for what he was. The lead agent grabbed Greg's wrist, snapping one cuff into place. Enough stalling. Hands behind your back. Greg jerked his arm, trying to pull away, but another agent stepped in, forcing his arms behind him. The cold metal locked around his wrists, and in that moment, the reality set in. He wasn't the one in control anymore. The courtroom held its breath. Greg's voice dropped to something almost like a whisper. This isn't over. Janelle held his gaze, unwavering. Oh, it is. And you're going to spend a long time realizing that. The agent started leading him toward the doors, his steps slow, heavy, like a man walking toward his own execution. The once imposing officer, the man who had built his career on intimidation and control, was now just another prisoner being led away. As they reached the doorway, he turned his head slightly, looking back at Janelle one last time, his expression an unreadable mix of fury and something else, something that looked a lot like fear. Janelle didn't move, didn't blink. She just watched. And then, just before he was dragged out of sight, she spoke one last time. I told you, Greg. You picked the wrong one. The doors shut behind him. Silence stretched in the courtroom, a heavy, undeniable finality settling over the space. Janelle exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders loosening, but only slightly. Because this wasn't just about Greg Larsson. He was just one of many. And now, thanks to him, the real work was about to begin. The weight of what had just happened still hung thick in the air. The doors had barely finished closing behind Greg Larsson, and yet the echoes of his downfall lingered. The courtroom was hushed, as if the very walls needed a moment to process the shift in power, the irreversible turn of fate. People exchanged glances, whispered amongst themselves, but no one dared to break the fragile silence completely. Janelle remained standing, her body still, her breathing even. She had won. But the victory, though satisfying, did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The judge exhaled, tapping his fingers against the bench before clearing his throat. Special Agent Carter, he addressed her now, his tone measured. You are, of course, free to go. This court acknowledges that you were wrongfully detained and mistreated under the authority of Officer Larsson. He paused, choosing his words carefully. On behalf of this institution, I regret what has transpired here today. Janelle turned her gaze toward him, studying his face. His regret seemed genuine, but it was also layered with something else, something heavier. A quiet understanding that Greg Larsson was not an isolated case, that there were others like him still walking freely, still making decisions that held the power to destroy lives. She nodded, acknowledging his words, but she did not say thank you. Because gratitude had no place in a moment like this. She should have never been in that chair to begin with. The judge hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. Agent Carter, will you be pursuing further action? Janelle's fingers curled slightly at her sides. She already knew the answer to that. Yes, she said without hesitation. This doesn't end here. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled again, and from the corner of her eye, she caught sight of several uniformed officers shifting uncomfortably. Not all of them had been on Larsson's side. Some had simply remained silent, watching as injustice unfolded, unwilling to speak up but too ashamed to actively participate. And now, that silence was costing them. She turned slowly, letting her eyes sweep across the room. Some of you knew what he was, she said, her voice controlled but firm. You knew what he did. You knew how he operated. And yet, you did nothing. A few officers dropped their gazes, their postures stiff. Others bristled, their expressions hardening, defensive. Janelle continued, taking a step forward. I'm not just talking about Larsson. He's gone. But the system that allowed him to thrive? That still exists. Her gaze locked onto one officer in particular, a man who had been sitting near the back, quiet but observant, his lips pressed into a thin line. So here's your choice. You can either clean house yourselves, or I'll do it for you. A thick silence followed, heavier than the first. No one moved. Then, from somewhere in the back, an officer spoke, his voice rough. And what makes you think you can just come in here and tear this department apart? Janelle turned toward him, unflinching. Because I have proof. And if you think what just happened to Larsson was bad, I suggest you think long and hard about what happens next. The officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Janelle exhaled slowly before looking back at the judge. I assume I'm free to leave. The judge nodded. You are. She didn't waste another second. Turning, she walked toward the exit, the sound of her heels sharp against the polished floor. As she reached the doors, she paused, glancing over her shoulder one last time. Clean your house, she said simply. Then she pushed through the doors, leaving them to sit with the wreckage. Outside, the air was crisp, but it did little to cool the fire still burning inside her. She barely made it down the courthouse steps before she spotted the group of reporters waiting at the bottom, microphones and cameras poised, their faces eager, hungry for a statement. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. The moment she stepped forward, the questions came all at once, a blur of voices competing to be heard. Agent Carter, what do you have to say about Officer Larsson's arrest? Do you believe this will lead to more investigations within the police force? Do you think there are more officers involved in similar misconduct? Janelle raised a hand, silencing the noise almost instantly. She let the quiet stretch just long enough to command attention before she spoke. What happened today is not just about one officer, she said, her voice firm. This is about a system that allowed him to operate unchecked for years. A system that many of you, her eyes flickered over some of the journalists she recognized from covering past cases, have reported on before. And yet, here we are, still having the same conversations, still exposing the same corruption. A few reporters exchanged glances. I will say this once, Janelle continued. This investigation is far from over. If you think today was shocking, I suggest you pay close attention to what comes next. More questions erupted, but she didn't stay to answer them. Instead, she turned and walked away, her mind already shifting toward the next steps. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from an unknown number. You're making enemies. Be careful. She stared at it for a moment, her grip tightening around the device. Then she exhaled, locked the screen, and kept walking. She had never been afraid of enemies. The weight of the message on Janelle's phone lingered in her mind, but she refused to let it shake her. She had anticipated this. She had known, from the moment she walked out of that courthouse, that the fallout wouldn't just end with Greg Larsson's arrest. There were people much higher up than him, who wouldn't take kindly to their secrets being dragged into the light. People who had long operated in the shadows, who had protected men like Larsson, ensuring that their dirty work was never exposed. And now, for the first time, someone had cracked that foundation. Sliding her phone back into her pocket, she let out a slow breath and continued walking toward her car. The courthouse steps behind her still buzzed with activity, reporters scrambling to put together their stories, officers exchanging hushed words, trying to assess the damage that had just been done. But the real damage? That was only beginning. As she reached her car, a voice rang out behind her, cutting through the murmurs and the distant hum of traffic. "You're making this bigger than it has to be." Janelle paused, recognizing the voice instantly. Detective Ryan Whitaker. He had been in the courtroom, sitting just far enough back that he could watch everything unfold without being in the spotlight himself. He hadn't spoken up when Larsson was dragged out in cuffs. Hadn't defended him, but hadn't condemned him either. He was part of the department, part of the system, and yet, something about the way he had been watching made her pause. She turned slowly, her gaze sharp as it locked onto him. "Bigger than it has to be," she repeated, her voice even. "Larsson spent years getting away with this because people let him. Because people like you looked the other way. Now that he's finally facing consequences, suddenly it's too big." Whitaker exhaled, his expression shifting, as if he was weighing his words carefully. "This isn't just about him anymore," he said, lowering his voice. "You put a target on your back." Janelle let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "There's always been a target on my back, Whitaker. You just never noticed it because men like Larsson were too busy putting targets on everyone else." His jaw tightened. "Not every cop in that department is like him." "Then why didn't you stop him?" Silence. For the first time, Whitaker looked away, his gaze shifting to the pavement as he exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. When he looked back at her, there was something different in his expression. Something heavier. "You don't get it, do you?" he muttered. "The department is a machine. You take down one cog, and the rest of it keeps turning. You think getting rid of Larsson changes anything?" Janelle studied him for a moment, then took a step forward. "No," she admitted. "But it's a start." Whitaker let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "And what if I told you that people higher up than Larsson are watching you now? That what you just did, what you exposed, has them worried?" Janelle's fingers curled slightly at her sides, but outwardly, she remained composed. "Then I'd say it's about damn time they started worrying." Whitaker glanced around, making sure no one was listening, before he took a step closer. His voice was lower now, more urgent. "You didn't hear this from me, but Larsson wasn't working alone. There are names you haven't uncovered yet. People who protected him, who buried the complaints, who made sure nothing stuck." Janelle's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "How high does it go?" His jaw clenched. "Higher than you want to believe. The kind of people who don't just make problems disappear, they make people disappear." For the first time, a chill ran down her spine, but she refused to let it show. "And what are you doing about it?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm still here, aren't I? Talking to you. That's more than most would do." She studied him, trying to gauge whether this was guilt, fear, or something in between. "If you really want to make a difference, Whitaker, then stop whispering in parking lots and start speaking where it counts." Whitaker exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "It's not that simple." Janelle tilted her head. "No, it's not. But it's the right thing to do. And eventually, you're going to have to decide whether you want to be part of the machine or the one who finally helps dismantle it." He didn't respond immediately. His jaw worked, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides. He was torn, she could see it. He had spent years being part of that system, and now, for the first time, he was being forced to confront it. Finally, he exhaled and took a step back. "You need to be careful," he said quietly. "They won't just let this go." Janelle's lips pressed together. They don't have a choice. Whitaker let out a humorless chuckle. You really believe that? She met his gaze. I have to. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without another word, Whitaker turned and walked away, disappearing into the thinning crowd outside the courthouse. Janelle watched him go, her mind already spinning with the implications of what he had just told her. She had known there were more, but now she had confirmation. And if Whitaker was right, if the people above Larsson were as dangerous as he suggested, then she was nowhere near done. She pulled open her car door and got in, exhaling slowly as she rested her hands on the steering wheel. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another unknown number. You're in deeper than you realize. Back off. Janelle stared at the message for a long moment. Then, without hesitation, she deleted it and tossed her phone onto the passenger seat. They thought a text message would scare her. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Janelle sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating, but she refused to let it consume her. Her mind was working at lightning speed, processing every detail, every name, every threat. She had spent years uncovering corruption, exposing men who thought they were untouchable, but this was different. This time, she wasn't just investigating. She was the target. The message on her phone had been brief, but the warning was clear. Back off. A threat meant to intimidate, to plant fear deep in her bones, to make her question if this fight was worth the risk. But if they thought she was the kind of person to back down, they had seriously underestimated her. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call. The number was blocked. She stared at the screen, debating for only a second before answering. Carter. A pause. Then a voice, deep and steady, but laced with something colder beneath it. You should have left it alone. Her grip on the phone tightened, her heartbeat steady despite the rush of adrenaline creeping into her system. You'll have to be more specific, she said, her tone smooth, almost amused. I dig up a lot of things people want left alone. A slow exhale on the other end of the line. Walk away now, and you can keep your career. Your life. Keep pushing, and we both know how this ends. Janelle leaned back against her seat, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, scanning the street for any signs of movement. You must be getting desperate if you're calling me yourself. People like you don't usually do your own dirty work. Silence. Then, a quiet, humorless chuckle. You think you're in control here? Janelle smirked, shifting in her seat. I know I am. Another pause. Then the line went dead. She let out a slow breath, locking her phone and setting it on the passenger seat. She had what she needed. The panic in that voice, subtle, controlled, but present, told her everything. She was closer than they wanted her to be. Her next move had to be careful. Calculated. She had stirred the hornet's nest, and now, the people in the shadows were moving. She pulled away from the courthouse, driving without a real destination for a few blocks, letting her thoughts settle, letting the plan form in her mind. Then, finally, she made the call. It rang twice before the line picked up, a smooth but wary voice answering on the other end. Didn't expect to hear from you so soon. Janelle's fingers tapped against the steering wheel. We need to meet. A pause. That bad? Worse. A sigh. Fine. Same place? No, Janelle said. Somewhere new. I'll send you a location. The call ended, and she pulled into a quiet parking lot, staring at the screen before typing out an address. 30 minutes later, she was sitting in a dimly lit diner, a cup of black coffee in front of her, untouched. The scent of burnt toast and cheap bacon lingered in the air, the low hum of conversation blending with the soft clatter of dishes. The bell over the door jingled, and she didn't need to look up to know who had just walked in. Marcus Hayes. Former FBI. Former ally. A man who had once been in her exact position, until he decided the system wasn't worth fighting for anymore. He slid into the booth across from her, his sharp eyes scanning the room before resting on her. "You look like hell." Janelle smirked. "You should see the other guy." Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right. Let's hear it. What kind of mess did you get yourself into this time?" Janelle didn't waste time. She laid it all out: Larsson, the files, the department's involvement, the anonymous messages, the phone call. By the time she was done, Marcus had gone quiet, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head. "You always did have a talent for pissing off the wrong people." Janelle leaned forward. "I need names. I need to know who's pulling the strings." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then ran a hand down his face. "You don't get it, Janelle. These aren't just dirty cops. These are people who have been protecting each other for decades. You think Larsson was the worst of them? He was a symptom. The disease runs deeper." Janelle exhaled, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "Then I need to cut deeper." Marcus let out a humorless laugh. "You're going to get yourself killed." Janelle smirked. "Not if I get them first." Marcus shook his head. Same Janelle Carter. Always thinking 2 steps ahead, always believing you can outplay people who have been in this game longer than you've been alive. Janelle shrugged. "And yet, here I am. Still standing. Still winning." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You don't stop, do you?" "No," Janelle said simply. A thick silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Marcus sighed. "I might have something. But if I tell you, you didn't hear it from me." Janelle nodded. "Understood." Marcus reached into his jacket, pulling out a small flash drive. He slid it across the table, his expression grim. "Everything I could dig up. Names, connections, the whole web. But be careful. These aren't people who leave loose ends." Janelle picked up the drive, rolling it between her fingers. "Good thing I don't plan on being one." Marcus exhaled sharply, then stood. "Be smart about this, Carter." She smirked. "Always." He gave her one last look before turning and walking out of the diner. Janelle sat there for a long moment, staring at the flash drive in her palm. This was it. The final piece. Now it was time to burn it all down. Janelle sat in a high-rise office overlooking the city skyline, the weight of the past few weeks settling into her bones. The flash drive Marcus had given her had been the final key, unlocking a labyrinth of corruption that stretched far beyond Greg Larsson. It was bigger than just one officer, bigger than just one department. This was a system that had been designed to protect itself, to erase evidence, to silence anyone who got too close. But this time, they had failed. She had spent the last 72 hours in an undisclosed location, working with a select group of federal investigators who were just as determined as she was to bring this entire network crashing down. They had built the case brick by brick, name by name, until the structure of corruption was exposed in its entirety. The warrants had already been signed. It was only a matter of time before everything imploded. The news broke before dawn. Headlines flashed across every major network. Mass arrests in corruption scandal, high-ranking officers indicted. Years of misconduct exposed in federal probe. Systemic racism and abuse of power uncovered in explosive FBI investigation. Janelle watched from her office as reporters swarmed the front steps of multiple precincts, capturing footage of men in suits and uniforms being led out in handcuffs. Some protested, some remained stone-faced, and some, like Greg Larsson, looked as though the ground had been ripped from beneath them. She had no sympathy for any of them. Larsson, stripped of his badge and his so-called authority, had been hit the hardest. The federal charges against him were severe: civil rights violations, falsifying police reports, abuse of power, obstruction of justice. But the true devastation came when the recordings were released. The ones from his patrol car. The ones from the interrogation room. The ones that proved, without a shadow of a doubt, what he had done. His former colleagues abandoned him without hesitation. Those who had once laughed at his jokes, covered for his misdeeds, pretended not to see his abuses, they turned their backs the moment it was no longer convenient to stand beside him. He was alone now, drowning in the consequences of his own actions. He tried to fight the charges, tried to play the victim, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the verdict was handed down, guilty on all counts, he didn't even look surprised. Just hollow. Detective Ryan Whitaker had made his choice as well. He had come forward with information, not because he wanted redemption, but because he had finally realized that silence was no longer an option. His cooperation had spared him from indictment, but his reputation within the department was destroyed. He had been reassigned, sent somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the city where he had once operated in the shadows. Marcus Hayes, ever the ghost, had disappeared before the dust had even settled. Janelle wasn't surprised. He had given her what she needed, and in doing so, had ensured that his name wouldn't be among the ones dragged through the mud. He had been on the inside long enough to know when it was time to vanish. Janelle, however, remained exactly where she was. She had no reason to run. She had one. She stepped away from the window, her mind already moving to the next case, the next battle. Because there would always be another. This wasn't a victory that fixed everything. It wasn't a solution to decades of injustice. It was just another step forward in a fight that would never truly end. But for now, it was enough. She exhaled, a slow, steady breath, before picking up her phone and dialing a number. The line clicked after the first ring. "This is Carter," she said. "Let's get to work." And just like that, the next chapter began. Now, let's take a moment to reflect. This wasn't just a story about corruption or justice. It was a story about power, who holds it, who abuses it, and who is willing to fight back. How many times do we witness injustice and stay silent? How often do we convince ourselves that the system is too big to fight? Janelle didn't have the luxury of looking the other way. And maybe, neither do we. What would you have done in her place? Would you have walked away? Would you have fought? And more importantly, how do you think this story reflects the world we live in today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, ones that challenge, surprise, and keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next.